The marble floors are cracking. Water seeps through the foundation of a villa worth more than most provincial cities. The senator inside doesn't leave. He orders slaves to mop the floor and continues his banquet. This isn't Pompeii. There's no eruption, no sudden catastrophe. The ground beneath Baiae has been sinking for decades. Everyone knows. No one leaves. By the time Rome falls, this city, the most infamous pleasure capital in human history, will be completely underwater, not destroyed by barbarians, not buried by a volcano, erased by its own refusal to acknowledge what was happening beneath its feet. This is the story of how Rome's elite watched their paradise sink into the sea and chose excess over survival. The Bay of Naples curves like a sickle around some of the most geologically unstable land in the Mediterranean. Vesuvius looms to the east. To the west, a fractured volcanic region the Romans call the Phlegraean Fields, the burning fields. The earth here doesn't stay still. It breathes, rises, falls, splits open to release sulfurous gases and superheated water. For most people, this would be a warning. For Rome's elite, it becomes an invitation. Baiae sits on the northwestern edge of the bay, a small settlement that transforms over 2 centuries into something unprecedented in the ancient world. The volcanic activity that makes the region dangerous also produces something the Romans have never encountered at this scale: naturally heated springs. Water emerges from the ground, at temperatures perfect for bathing, infused with minerals the Romans believe have medicinal properties. The first visitors come for health. They stay for something else entirely. By the 1st century BCE, Baiae has stopped being a spa town. It's become a laboratory for excess. The wealthiest families in Rome build villas here that make their city homes look modest. These aren't country estates. They're palaces constructed on a scale that announces power and wealth with brutal clarity. Gaius Marius, the general who reforms Rome's military, builds here. Pompey the Great, whose conquests stretch from Spain to Syria, builds here. Julius Caesar builds here. So does his assassin, Brutus. Later, the emperors themselves will claim the best positions along the coastline. The architecture reflects a society that has stopped pretending restraint matters. Villas cascade down hillsides and terraces, each level offering views of the bay while concealing the activities within. Private ports allow visitors to arrive by boat, bypassing public roads entirely. Some villas have fish pools larger than temples, stocked with delicacies from across the empire. Others have baths fed by the volcanic springs, rooms where steam and shadow make it impossible to identify who's present. The wealthiest Romans spend fortunes on oyster beds positioned to catch the perfect combination of fresh and salt water, producing shellfish that become synonymous with Baiae's reputation. But it's not the architecture that defines Baiae. It's what happens inside. The Roman elite maintains strict social codes in the city proper. Senators present themselves as paragons of Roman virtue, gravitas, dignitas, the old values of the Republic. Baiae is where those masks come off. Distance from Rome provides psychological cover. The bay provides physical separation. The volcanic landscape, with its myths and hidden grottos, provides concealment. What emerges is a culture of transgression so systematic that ancient writers describe Baiae not as a resort, but as a trap. Sextus Propertius, writing during Augustus's reign, warns young women to avoid Baiae entirely. The place, he writes, is an enemy to chastity. Seneca the Younger, philosopher and advisor to Nero, calls it a resort of vice, a place where moral discipline goes to die. Martial's epigrams describe Baiae as the location where proper Roman matrons transform into something unrecognizable to their husbands. These aren't scandalous rumors. They're accepted descriptions of what Baiae represents in Roman consciousness. The archaeological evidence supports the texts. Villas feature architectural elements designed for privacy and concealment, hidden passages, rooms without clear purpose, bathing complexes far too elaborate for simple hygiene. One villa has a tunnel network extensive enough to move between buildings without surfacing. Another has a rotating dining floor, allowing guests to change their view, or their companions, without leaving the table. The infrastructure of secrecy is built into Baiae's foundations. Sexual transgression becomes Baiae's defining characteristic. But it's not the only form of excess practiced here. Political conspiracies are planned in rooms designed to prevent eavesdropping. Business deals that would be scandalous in the forum are negotiated over wine while bathers lounge in heated pools. Poisonings occur with enough frequency that ancient sources treat them as routine. When the younger Agrippina wants to eliminate rivals to secure her son Nero's path to power, she does it at Baiae. When wealthy Romans want to remove inconvenient spouses, Baiae provides both the opportunity and the cover. The emperors are the worst offenders. Tiberius, Rome's second emperor, effectively abandons Rome to live on Capri, across the bay from Baiae. The activities attributed to him during this period are so extreme that historians debate whether they can possibly be true, or whether Tiberius's enemies simply understood that locating depravity at Baiae makes it believable. Caligula, his successor, reportedly builds a temporary bridge across the bay from Baiae to Puteoli, then rides across it wearing the breastplate of Alexander the Great, just to prove he can accomplish the impossible. The bridge consumes enough resources to cause grain shortages. Caligula doesn't care. Demonstrating power matters more than consequences. Nero, inheriting both the throne and Baiae's influence, uses the location to stage elaborate performances of his own design. When his mother Agrippina becomes an obstacle to his absolute rule, Nero invites her to Baiae for a reconciliation. The ship he provides for her return journey is rigged to collapse at sea. The assassination attempt fails. Agrippina survives by swimming to shore, but the intention is clear. Even matricide becomes theater at Baiae, staged against volcanic landscapes and imperial villas. What makes Baiae's culture possible isn't just distance from Rome, it's the geology itself. The volcanic features that initially attracted visitors also create an environment where normal rules seem suspended. Hot springs emerge from the earth without apparent cause. Caves exhale toxic gases that produce hallucinations. The ground steams. The water in some pools bubbles without fire. Ancient Romans, lacking modern geological knowledge, interpret these phenomena as evidence of divine or infernal presence. The Romans believe one cave is the entrance to the underworld. They're wrong about the mythology, but right about the danger. The cave emits carbon dioxide at concentrations high enough to kill. This combination of natural spectacle and human excess creates a feedback loop. Baiae's reputation for transgression attracts those seeking to escape moral accountability. Their presence reinforces the culture of excess. The architecture adapts to enable ever more elaborate forms of concealment and display. Within a century of becoming fashionable, Baiae represents something unprecedented in Roman experience, a place where wealth, power, and moral rot concentrate without apparent consequence. But there are consequences. They're just happening too slowly for anyone to treat them as urgent. The same volcanic forces that created Baiae's hot springs are destroying its foundations. The region experiences bradyseism, a geological phenomenon where land rises and falls in response to magma chamber pressure below. It's not dramatic. There are no earthquakes that level buildings, no lava flows, no eruptions that bury the city in ash. Instead, the land moves in increments measured in centimeters per year. Coastal villas find their lowest floors periodically flooding. Harbor installations require constant adjustment as water levels change unpredictably. Temples built at what seems like safe elevation above the bay discover their foundations underwater within a generation. The Romans notice. Of course they notice. They're master engineers who build aqueducts spanning dozens of miles with precision accurate to the centimeter. They understand land surveying, water management, structural integrity. They can see that Baiae's relationship with the sea is changing. What they can't see, or won't see, is that this represents a terminal problem rather than an engineering challenge. The denial isn't based on ignorance. It's based on a calculation that the rewards of staying outweigh the costs of leaving. By the end of the 1st century CE, Baiae has become essential to imperial power. Emperors maintain villas here. The elite own property they've invested fortunes in. Political networks depend on the privacy Baiae provides. Cultural expectations assume that anyone with real wealth has a presence on the Bay of Naples. Abandoning Baiae isn't a practical decision about unsafe real estate. It's a signal that you're surrendering status, influence, and access to the networks that determine power in Rome. The calculation is simple. Staying is dangerous. but leaving is suicide for your position in Roman society. So they stay, and the water keeps rising. The first structures to succumb are the ones closest to the waterline. Fish pools flood permanently, their expensive populations lost. Private harbors require extensive reconstruction to remain functional. Villa basements fill with seawater that corrodes everything it touches. The Romans respond with engineering. They build higher, they construct elevated platforms, they redesign harbor facilities to accommodate new water levels. Each intervention works temporarily, creating the impression that human ingenuity can overcome geological reality. But the geology doesn't care about engineering. The Bradesiism continues. What worked 5 years ago fails. Structures built to new specifications become obsolete before construction is complete. Some villas are modified so extensively that their lower floors are simply abandoned, sealed off, and written off as lost space. The Romans adapt the same way societies always adapt to gradual decline, by normalizing deterioration and pretending temporary solutions are permanent fixes. Ancient writers begin referencing Baiae's instability as common knowledge. Strabo, the Greek geographer writing during Augustus's reign, describes the Phlegraean fields and notes the land's tendency to rise and fall unpredictably. Seneca, in his Natural Questions, discusses volcanic phenomena in the region and observes that the very features making Baiae attractive are evidence of instability. These aren't warnings from alarmists. They're observations from educated Romans who understand what's happening. The information is available. It's being documented, and it's being ignored. The psychology of gradual collapse is different from sudden disaster. Pompeii, buried in 79 CE by Vesuvius, becomes legendary precisely because its destruction is instantaneous and total. There's no time to adapt, no opportunity to normalize the danger. One moment, the city exists. The next, it doesn't. Survivors have trauma, but also clarity. Baiae's destruction offers neither. It's slow enough that each incremental loss can be absorbed, rationalized, explained as temporary setback rather than permanent decline. The danger never feels acute enough to override the rewards of staying. This is how Rome's elite watch their pleasure capital sink and make the choice to remain. The Temple of Mercury provides the clearest evidence of what's happening to Baiae and why no one treats it as catastrophic. Built during the Republic, possibly by the same engineers who designed Rome's great aqueducts, the temple is actually a massive domed structure, one of the largest in the ancient world before the Pantheon. Its purpose isn't purely religious, it's an architectural demonstration project, showing what Roman engineering can accomplish with concrete and advanced dome construction. The interior houses a thermal pool fed by volcanic springs. For generations, it's one of Baiae's defining features, attracting visitors who want to experience advanced architecture while bathing in waters believed to have healing properties. By the early 2nd century CE, the Temple of Mercury's lowest levels are permanently underwater, not metaphorically, not occasionally, permanently. The structure itself remains intact. Roman concrete is almost indestructible. But the relationship between building and water has fundamentally changed. What was built as a marvel of controlled environment becomes a flooded ruin still in use. Visitors adapt. They access higher levels. They treat the flooded spaces as part of the experience, perhaps even as evidence of the mysterious volcanic forces that make Baiae special. The building is failing in real time, and the response is to incorporate that failure into its identity. This pattern repeats across the city. The Sosandra Baths, another major complex, experience similar flooding. Mosaics that once decorated floors become visible only underwater. Rooms designed for specific bathing rituals become inaccessible. The response isn't evacuation, it's modification. New baths are constructed at higher elevations. Old facilities are partially abandoned, but not demolished. Demolition would require acknowledging total failure. Instead, they're left to flood, while new construction continues around them, creating archaeological layers that tell the story of a society building upward to escape rising water. The Bradesiism isn't constant or predictable, which makes the psychology of denial easier to maintain. Some years, the land rises, and it appears the problem might be resolving itself. Water levels drop slightly, flooded areas become accessible again. Optimistic property owners invest in repairs, convincing themselves the worst has passed. Then the land sinks again, often dropping faster than it rose. The pattern creates false hope that prevents coordinated response. There's always a recent precedent for thinking things might improve, making it easier to justify staying through the current crisis. Harbor facilities suffer catastrophically. Ancient Baiae has multiple port complexes serving different functions. Commercial ports for goods and supplies, military ports for the Roman fleet, private ports for villa owners who want direct access to their properties from the sea. As the land subsides, these facilities require constant reconstruction. Docks built at one elevation become unusable within years as water levels change. Warehouses flood. Ship sheds become inaccessible. The Romans respond with typical engineering ambition, building new structures on top of old, extending facilities outward into deeper water, constructing artificial breakwaters to create protected harbors in areas that previously didn't need them. The archaeological remains, studied extensively after the underwater ruins rediscovery, show at least 4 different construction phases for some harbor structures, each representing adaptation to changed water levels. This isn't infrastructure maintenance. It's desperate reaction to losing ground, literally, faster than engineering can compensate. The economic cost is staggering. Each reconstruction cycle consumes resources that could build new facilities elsewhere, but admitting defeat means abandoning investments already made, so the cycle continues. Elite property owners face impossible calculations. A villa that cost a fortune to build and maintain represents more than real estate. It's a symbol of social position, a location for networking with other powerful Romans, a venue for activities that can't happen in Rome itself. Abandoning that property means accepting total financial loss. There's no market for villas everyone knows are sinking. It also means losing access to social networks that operate through Baiae's geography of concealed spaces and private access. The rational choice, purely from a safety perspective, is to leave. The rational choice from a social and economic perspective is to stay and hope engineering solutions can extend the property's viability long enough to justify the sunk costs. So they stay, and they rebuild, and they watch their neighbors do the same. The behavior becomes self-reinforcing. If everyone else is staying and rebuilding, leaving marks you as either cowardly or financially unable to sustain your properties. Both interpretations damage your social position. The collective action problem is obvious. Everyone would benefit from coordinating departure and relocating to stable ground. But the first person to leave loses while everyone else is still maintaining their positions. The last person to leave loses everything because by then there's no social scene to participate in. The Nash equilibrium is for everyone to stay until the situation becomes absolutely untenable, even though that strategy guarantees maximum aggregate loss. The Roman state, which could theoretically impose coordinated evacuation or ban new construction in geologically unstable areas, does nothing. Imperial administration focuses on maintaining order, collecting taxes, defending borders, managing grain supply. Baiae's gradual subsidence doesn't threaten any of these priorities. Individual property owners are wealthy enough to absorb their own losses. There's no disaster requiring emergency response, no refugee crisis, no military threat. From the state's perspective, Baiae is functioning normally. Wealthy Romans are doing what wealthy Romans do, which is spending extravagant sums on luxury properties and dealing with the consequences themselves. This indifference from central authority reinforces local denial. If the emperor still maintains properties at Baiae, if senators still build villas here, if the administrative apparatus treats the city as a normal part of Roman Italy, then perhaps the geological problems aren't as serious as they appear. Perhaps engineering really can solve this. Perhaps the last sinking was the worst it will get. The absence of official concern becomes evidence that concern is unnecessary, even as water continues rising and structures continue failing. The cultural meaning of Baiae begins to shift during this period. For earlier generations, it was primarily a symbol of pleasure and excess. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, it's becoming something else, a demonstration of Roman power's ability to persist despite obvious challenges. Maintaining presence at Baiae proves that geological inconveniences don't dictate behavior to Rome's elite. They control nature. Nature doesn't control them. This ideological investment makes practical responses even harder. Leaving Baiae isn't just admitting defeat to geological forces. It's admitting that Roman power has limits. Meanwhile, the physical city continues its slow-motion collapse. Walls crack as foundations settle unevenly. Mosaics buckle. Frescoes peel as moisture penetrates. Some villas develop serious structural problems. Walls leaning, roofs sagging, floors tilting at noticeable angles. These properties are abandoned finally when they become genuinely dangerous. But even then, the response isn't coordinated evacuation. It's selective abandonment of the worst properties while others remain occupied. The city develops a patchwork quality. Some areas still functioning, others empty but not demolished, creating a landscape of visible decay that everyone pretends not to see. The 3rd century brings broader crises to the Roman Empire: political instability, military threats on multiple frontiers, economic disruption, plague. These problems dwarf Baiae's slow subsidence. Imperial administration fragments. Central authority weakens. The resources and attention needed to address gradual geological change in one minor resort, cities simply aren't available. Baiae's decline accelerates not because the geology worsens, though it continues, but because the supporting infrastructure that made life there possible begins failing for non-geological reasons. Aqueducts require maintenance, roads need repair, ports need dredging, supply chains need security. When the broader empire starts fragmenting, these services become unreliable. A villa might be structurally sound, but if fresh water supply becomes intermittent and food deliveries unreliable, it's not viable regardless of geological stability. The social networks that justified staying, despite danger, start dissolving. Important senators have problems more urgent than maintaining vacation properties. New emperors lack connection to Baiae's traditions. The younger generation of elite families, facing empire-wide crises, can't justify their father's attachment to sinking villas on the Bay of Naples. Population declines gradually, not through mass exodus, but through attrition. Properties are abandoned when owners die without heirs interested in maintaining them. Villa staffs are reduced, then eliminated entirely. Some buildings are stripped of valuable materials, marble, bronze, lead pipes, by their own owners looking to recoup some investment before final abandonment. This salvage operation creates its own archaeological signature: rooms left empty with mounting holes where metal fixtures were removed, floor sections missing where valuable stone was pulled up, walls showing damage from systematic removal of anything portable and valuable. By the late 3rd century, Baiae is a shadow of what it was at its height. Sections of the city are completely abandoned. Harbor facilities fall into disrepair. Villas stand empty with roofs collapsing and vegetation overtaking structures. The remaining occupied properties cluster in areas that have, temporarily, maintained stable relationships with the waterline. But even these are surrounded by evidence of failure: flooded buildings visible offshore, ruined structures on land, infrastructure crumbling without maintenance. And still, some Romans remain. Not the emperors, they have other residences, other concerns. Not the great senatorial families, most are focused on survival during the empire's crisis period. But lesser elite, provincial wealthy, people whose entire social position depends on maintaining a villa at Baiae, even as the city collapses around them. They're trapped by the same logic that kept earlier generations here. Leaving means admitting total loss. Staying at least maintains the fiction that things might recover, that this is temporary, that Roman engineering and wealth can ultimately overcome geology. The Christians, meanwhile, are watching and taking notes. Christianity is spreading through the Roman Empire during Baiae's slow decline, and early Christian writers have no affection for what the city represents. They see Baiae as a monument to everything wrong with pagan Rome: obsession with physical pleasure, moral corruption, wealth worship, the subordination of virtue to power. The city's gradual destruction, in Christian interpretation, isn't geological bad luck. It's divine judgment. God, in Christian theology, doesn't need dramatic eruptions or sudden catastrophes. He can destroy with patience, letting the wicked watch their works crumble while they choose not to repent. Early Christian texts reference Baiae as a cautionary example. Here was a city that epitomized earthly pleasure and worldly power. Here was a place where Rome's elite gathered to indulge every appetite while claiming moral superiority. And here, now, was that city sinking into the sea while its inhabitants rebuilt rather than reformed, choosing denial over repentance. The moral couldn't be clearer. The wages of sin might not be paid immediately, but they're always paid. This Christian interpretation gains influence as Christianity itself gains power in the 4th century. Constantine's conversion and the subsequent Christianization of the empire's upper classes changes cultural attitudes toward places like Baiae. What was once admired as sophisticated pleasure-seeking becomes condemned as pagan decadence. The elite who built and maintained Baiae weren't just engaging in excess. They were sinning against Christian God and suffering consequences visible to anyone paying attention. The remaining Romans at Baiae find themselves increasingly culturally isolated. Maintaining a villa here is no longer a mark of sophistication. It's evidence of attachment to pagan culture and pagan values. The social rewards that justified staying despite geological danger evaporate. Christian aristocrats build their country estates elsewhere, places without Baiae's tainted reputation. The city becomes associated not with power, but with the decadent past that Christianity claims to have superseded. By the 4th century, Baiae is essentially dead as a functioning city. Small populations persist in scattered locations. Some harbor facilities remain operational for practical shipping purposes unrelated to Baiae's resort history. A few structures are converted to new purposes or stripped for building materials. But the dense concentration of elite villas, the elaborate bath complexes, the architectural demonstrations of wealth and power, all of that is abandoned. Roofs cave in, walls collapse, vegetation overtakes structures. The sea continues its patient work, claiming land that hasn't already been abandoned. The final collapse isn't dramatic because there's nothing left to collapse dramatically. The city has been dying for so long that its death passes almost without notice. There's no siege, no eruption, no barbarian sack. Just incremental abandonment as the last holdouts finally accept what's been obvious for generations. Baiae cannot be saved because Baiae never should have been sustained once the geological instability became clear. The centuries of denial, reconstruction, and refusal to acknowledge reality have ended not in vindication, but in total loss. What remains is a landscape of ruins partially submerged, partially overgrown, and wholly abandoned. The water continues rising, structures continue sinking. Within another century, most of Baiae will be underwater, preserved by the sea it tried to ignore. The submersion is not an event. It's a process that continues long after anyone still lives at Baiae, long after the last villa is stripped of its valuables, long after the cultural memory of what the city represented fades from Roman consciousness. The Bradyseism doesn't stop simply because people have abandoned the area. The volcanic forces that raised and lowered the land continue operating on geological timescales that render human history irrelevant. Over the 5th and 6th centuries, as the Western Roman Empire fragments and falls, Baiae completes its transformation from ruined city to submerged archaeological site. The water rises gradually, or more accurately, the land sinks gradually while sea level remains constant. Structures that were abandoned as too damaged to occupy become structures half submerged, then 3/4 submerged, then completely underwater except for scattered remnants visible at low tide. The sea is not kind to Roman construction, but Roman concrete proves remarkably durable. Villas designed to last generations survive their submersion. Their walls intact, their rooms preserved, their mosaics still in place beneath meters of seawater. They become something unprecedented, an entire city frozen at various stages of its centuries-long collapse, accessible only to fish. The submersion solves a problem that would otherwise plague Baiae's ruins. On land, abandoned Roman cities are quarried for building materials. Marble is pulled up and reused. Bricks are salvaged. Metal is melted down. Stone is repurposed. Entire structures disappear as later generations mine them for materials. Underwater, this salvage work is impossible with ancient technology. The depth isn't extreme. Most of Baiae settles between 3 and 10 meters below the surface, but that's enough to make systematic material recovery impractical. The ruins are preserved by the same water that destroyed them. But preservation is not memory. As Baiae sinks, it also disappears from Roman culture in ways that have nothing to do with geology. Christian writers have been condemning Baiae for generations, but their condemnation changes character as the city physically vanishes. While Baiae still existed as ruins on land, it served as a useful cautionary example. Look what happens to cities built on sin. Once it's underwater, the rhetorical value changes. Now, Baiae can be erased entirely, written out of history as if it never mattered. Christian Rome is constructing a narrative of civilization, progressing from pagan darkness toward Christian enlightenment. Baiae, symbol of everything paganism represented, becomes inconvenient to the narrative. Better to forget it existed than to explain why Christianity's God allowed it to flourish for centuries before destroying it so gradually. The erasure is surprisingly thorough. Byzantine sources, continuing Roman tradition in the East, mention Baiae rarely and then only in contexts emphasizing its sinful reputation and deserved destruction. Western European sources, as new kingdoms emerge from the Western Empire's collapse, largely ignore Baiae entirely. The city doesn't fit into medieval historical frameworks. It's not a story of Christian martyrs or saintly founders. It's not a tale of barbarian conquest or Roman military glory. It's the embarrassing history of elite Romans behaving badly and refusing to acknowledge consequences until those consequences literally submerge them. Medieval and Renaissance writers who do reference Baiae treat it as a moral fable, not a historical place. The details of its architecture, its engineering, its gradual geological destruction, all of that is lost. What remains is reputation. Baiae was wicked, Baiae sank. Learn the appropriate lesson. The actual city, the physical reality of what happened and why, becomes inaccessible both literally, beneath the sea, and figuratively, beneath layers of moralistic interpretation. The Bay of Naples, meanwhile, continues its life as a strategic waterway and fishing ground. Local populations know there are ruins underwater. Fishermen occasionally snag nets on submerged structures. Divers retrieve fragments, a piece of marble, a broken amphora, but there's no systematic understanding of what's down there. The ruins are treated as navigational hazards or sources of salvageable material, not as the remains of a historically significant Roman city. The knowledge that this was Baiae, that these specific ruins represent a unique chapter in Roman history, fades completely. This erasure lasts for more than 1,000 years. The rediscovery begins with flight. In the 1940s, Italian pilots flying over the Bay of Naples noticed geometric shapes visible beneath the water. Straight lines, regular patterns, structures that are obviously artificial. Photographs taken from the air reveal what's invisible from sea level, an entire urban layout preserved underwater. Walls and floors and roads still intact, their patterns clear in the right light and sea conditions. The aerial photographs generate immediate archaeological interest. If these are Roman ruins, and if they're this extensive, they might represent a major discovery. Initial underwater surveys in the 1950s and 1960s confirm what the aerial photographs suggested. These aren't scattered ruins. This is a city, or rather, the submerged portions of a city that extended both above and below the current waterline. The identification comes through comparative analysis of ancient sources, archaeological investigation of nearby sites still on land, and systematic mapping of the underwater remains. The conclusion is certain. This is Baiae, the legendary pleasure capital that Roman writers described and Christian sources condemned, now preserved beneath the sea. The preservation is remarkable. Because submersion happened gradually and relatively gently, no earthquakes or violent destruction, many structures remain intact enough to understand their original purpose. Villas still have their floor plans visible. Mosaics remain in place, their colors still bright beneath the water. Statues, some still standing, others fallen but complete, rest on ancient floors. The Temple of Mercury, its massive dome still standing, looms in the underwater landscape like a monument to Roman engineering, surviving its own collapse. Fish swim through rooms where senators once planned conspiracies and emperors hosted banquets. Archaeological investigation of underwater Baiae reveals evidence supporting everything the ancient sources claimed about the city's character. The architecture is designed for privacy and concealment. Villa layouts include hidden passages and rooms with no obvious legitimate purpose. The concentration of luxury features, elaborate baths, expensive stonework, advanced engineering, confirms that this was a place where enormous wealth was concentrated. The gradual nature of submersion means the archaeological record preserves different chronological layers, showing how Romans adapted to rising water through centuries of denial and reconstruction. The underwater ruins also provide clear evidence of the Baiaeism that destroyed the city. Structures built at different periods rest at different depths, showing how water levels changed over time. Some buildings show clear signs of modification, doorways raised, new floors built above. Old, drainage systems added to cope with flooding. The harbor facilities, visible in their multiple construction phases, document centuries of feudal engineering responses to geological forces that couldn't be controlled. The archaeological record is a timeline of slow-motion collapse, visible in 3 dimensions beneath the bay. Modern geological studies of the Phlegraean fields confirm what the Romans couldn't have fully understood. This region is one of the most volcanically active in Europe. The Baiaeism that destroyed Baiae continues today. The land still rises and falls, though modern monitoring and evacuation planning mean contemporary populations aren't at the same risk Romans faced. The volcanic system that created Baiae's hot springs is the same system that could produce eruptions catastrophic for the entire Bay of Naples region. Scientists classify it as a supervolcano, capable of affecting global climate if it experiences major eruption. This geological context makes Baiae's history even more pointed. The Romans built their pleasure capital on some of the most dangerous land in the Mediterranean. The warning signs weren't subtle. The land literally moved beneath them. Hot springs and toxic gases provided obvious evidence of volcanic activity. Earthquakes periodically shook the region. They documented these phenomena. They understood, at some level, the danger. And they built anyway, invested fortunes anyway, stayed anyway, because the social and political rewards outweighed the personal risk assessment. The modern comparison is unavoidable. Contemporary societies build in flood zones, on earthquake faults, in areas threatened by rising sea levels. The pattern is identical: obvious danger, documented risk, and collective decisions to proceed anyway because relocation is expensive and inconvenient and might not be necessary for decades. Baiae's ruins, preserved underwater, testify to how that calculation ends when the hazard is real and the timeline is merely slower than political attention spans can maintain focus. But there's something more disturbing in Baiae's history than simple failure to evacuate dangerous territory. The Romans who stayed at Baiae weren't ignorant peasants trapped by poverty. They were the empire's elite: senators, generals, administrators, the people with resources to leave and knowledge to understand the risk. They watched the city sink for generations. They documented it. They discussed it. They built engineering responses to it. And they never considered, collectively, the possibility that they should abandon this place entirely. The idea was literally unthinkable because it meant acknowledging that Roman power and wealth couldn't overcome a geological problem. This is the pattern that makes Baiae's story resonate beyond its specific historical context. The danger wasn't invisible. The warnings weren't unclear. The consequences weren't sudden. Everything happened slowly enough that rational response was possible at any point over multiple generations. What prevented that response wasn't lack of information or inability to act. It was the combination of personal incentives to stay, social pressures against leaving, collective refusal to acknowledge that some problems can't be engineered away, and ideological investment in the idea that Roman power transcended natural limits. The ruins beneath the Bay of Naples are a monument to that failure. They're also a warning. The Christian interpretation of Baiae as divine judgment reveals something true even if you don't accept the theology. Societies that build their foundations on exploitation, that concentrate wealth and power in ways that require moral rot to sustain, that prioritize immediate pleasure over long-term stability, these societies are constructing their own destruction. The destruction might not come from moral causes directly. It might come from geology or climate or resource depletion or any number of material factors. But the moral rot matters because it prevents rational response to material danger. A society that rewards denial and punishes acknowledgement of problems will not respond effectively when those problems become critical. Baiae sank because the land beneath it was unstable, and the people on that land chose excess over survival. The geological instability was natural and inevitable. The choice to stay was human and avoidable. The combination produced a disaster that took centuries to complete, but was visible to anyone willing to see from the very beginning. The most dangerous collapses don't announce themselves with apocalyptic drama. They accumulate in increments small enough to normalize, rationalize, accept as the new baseline. They happen slowly enough that each generation can tell itself the crisis will be resolved before becoming catastrophic. They create incentive structures that reward staying and punish leaving, right up until the moment staying becomes impossible. By then, everything that could have been saved is lost. Baiae's ruins rest beneath the bay, preserved in their partial collapse, accessible to anyone who wants to dive into the water and swim through rooms where Rome's elite partied while their world sank. The villas are still there. The temples are still there. The harbor facilities, the baths, the architectural demonstrations of Roman engineering, all there, underwater, exactly where the Romans left them when denial finally ran out of ground to stand on. Modern visitors can scuba dive through Baiae's remains. The water is clear enough that sunlight penetrates to the ruins. Fish schools weave through columns. Mosaics glow on ancient floors. The Temple of Mercury's dome rises from the sea bottom, like a memory of what Roman power claimed it could accomplish. The experience is beautiful and haunting and deeply unsettling because the ruins don't look ancient in the sense of being remote or alien. They look familiar. They look like structures that could exist today, in forms recognizable to any modern person. They just happen to be underwater, surrounded by the patient destruction of everything their builders thought was permanent.